Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cave Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we once again have a wonderful opportunity to interview one of the apologetic heroes of our day. And we've actually met him before. He came to our church, and so I was telling him that I was putting that in my email to him so I could kind of strong arm him a little bit into interviewing with us, our little podcast here. But I want to introduce, for those who don't know, to J. Warner Wallace. He was a cold case homicide detective for the LAPD. He serves currently as the senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University, and a faculty member at Summit Ministries. J. Warner became a Christ follower at the age of 35 after investigating the claims of the New Testament Gospels using his skills as a detective. He eventually earned a master's degree in theological studies from Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author of such books as Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, Alive, and So the Next Generation Will Know, preparing young Christians for a challenging worldview. And he does have Cold Case Christianity for Kids, and I believe also God's Crime Scene for Kids as well. And a few other here and there. You can find him on Amazon Prime, he's got there, or Right Now Media if your church subscribes to that, or you subscribe to that. So he's everywhere, and we appreciate you coming on. Thank you, Detective Wallace.
Yeah.
Well, I fooled you into thinking that I'm everywhere, so that's a good. And that's good. That's good.
So you're an old, a new baby Christian. Everyone can tell that it's the California sun that has done it. So we kind of just want to get to know you and to kind of hear your story. But my very first question is, knowing the people that you've have sat across from in your cold case detective and your homicide detective, how does it feel coming on to any show where you know that you've been in front of worse people before?
Yeah,
like that must center you really well.
Yeah, it does. Like a lot of the times you have motives. I mean, you have a goal in your interviews when you're talking to somebody across the table from you who you know has committed a crime. Those conversations, right? It's kind of hard not to be really goal focused, right? But not to get to the truth. So those are generally a little more antagonistic in the sense that they're not cordial. It's not like, oh, I want to learn about you. Well, no, actually, I already know everything about you. I want you to get to this issue. So it's not. You're right. It's not nearly as much fun as just having a conversation. I think. But I will tell you this: the more I learn to just have a conversation with people I'm talking to get to know them on a personal level, which I never did before I became a Christian, the better I maintain some relationships with guys we put in jail. I know that some of these guys, when they come out, I'll probably be able to, if they ever do come out, I'll probably, they might contact me at some point. So I think that those are things that only happen because I had a shift in my thinking. I was 35 before that shift took place. I did a lot of cases, did a lot of really long interviews with robbery suspects and homicide suspects before I became a Christian. And my attitude was different in those days. You have a tendency to see yourself as the good guy. And I did that. I mean, I was on the job about 8 years before I was provoked to look at the Gospels. And I remember that my approach to people was different. You didn't realize, you always kind of, nobody comes to faith in Christianity and Jesus as Savior until they first understand their own need for a Savior. And in those days, I didn't see myself. I was one of the good guys taking bad guys to jail.
Yeah, you need to understand the bad news before you can know the good news. Right?
Yeah, no, that's so true. And so I had a different view. And my partners for years afterwards still had that view where they would say, hey, we're good people. We take bad people to jail. If there's a good God and a good heaven, we'll be there because we are good people. Right. So there's a sense in which, the unregenerate, the pre-Christian version of me really saw this difference between the people we were taking to jail and the people that were investigating the people we took to jail. Really, after becoming a Christian, it became pretty clear to me that there wasn't a big distinction between those two groups, that I really was, but for the grace of God, could easily be on the other side of the table, especially working cold cases, because cold cases are murders that are usually committed by just average, regular people who then spend the next 25 years living in a way that you would never, ever, ever guess they committed a murder 25 years ago. I don't work serial killers. I work, single murders that are committed by regular people who get away with it, and then they kind of live an ordinary life for the next 35 years until they finally get convicted. So it's really it helped me to understand that I'm not much different than that. And that changes the way you interview people. That changes the way you talk to anybody when you realize, hey, I'm not so different than you. So that did change the way my interviews took place.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Kind of put us in a setting and a time period for when you first got into your detective work, and then essentially what caused you to start questioning kind of Christianity, or what was it that was kind of the catalyst that got you started?
I think a lot of it was just my wife was interested in and had a good kind of a cultural experience with her mom, who was Catholic, growing up, to the point where she felt like this was something maybe we should consider when we're raising our own kids. Now, we had been together about 18 years before she convinced me to go to church. Wow. And as she was able to do that, I was more than willing. I just thought I would be going as an attendee. Right. I mean, look, if somebody wanted you to go on a chick flick with your wife, if you really want to see that movie, would you be willing to go because your wife wants to see that movie? Of course you would, I would think. And if that happened every week, would you be willing to go? I think you would. You might at least maybe 3 out of the 4 weeks, you might be willing to go see that movie. Yeah. That's kind of how I considered, my approach to this. I can go, and I might even get something out of it. It doesn't have to be true in order for it to have value, especially if it helps us raise our kids. That was my view.
Interesting.
Now, did I mock the Christians that I met? Yeah, I did. And the people who knew me, who also enjoyed it, because a lot of the Christians we met were people we were taken to jail, and they were easy to mock. Wow. So a lot of the people that we would kind of make fun of were the people who we thought whatever these Christians are like, they're not very good people because they're doing all these crimes. Yeah. And go in their house after they've done a murder 25 years ago, and you'll find, I remember one guy went in his house after he did this murder years earlier. We're going there for the interviews, and I found about 12 years of Bible studies in his living room. And I just thought, here we go. This is it, right? So I was condescending for the most part, but I wasn't out to prove it wrong. Like my friend Lee Strobel, when Leslie became a Christian, he really did. It bothered him, and he was out to prove it wrong. And his story in Case for Christ is different than mine. I didn't think this was worth even investigating. In other words, you don't investigate the existence of the Easter Bunny. Right. This is the kind of category that I had this in, so that it made no sense to me to even take it seriously. But the pastor in this church that my wife decided we should attend was clever enough. He knew he had unbelievers in that room, and he described Jesus as the smartest man who ever lived. He described Jesus as a historical character who had such great influence over the course of history that all history was somehow changed, that we were in this ripple effect. We were in the ripples of this stone that had been dropped in history. And everything we were experiencing, we were just riding the cascading ripples of this event. And I thought to myself, if that was true, I should be able to investigate that to see if that's true, right? I mean, I should be able to see, well, number one, why do we think he's so smart? And number two, why did he have the kind of, does he really, look, I lived in Southern California, and I still live in the same area. And I will tell you, growing up in Los Angeles County, I had no problem living a life outside the church, knowing no Christians until, really I was an adult. Because the area here is so large, it's such an urban area. The closer the city is to the ocean, the closer a city is to, the larger a city is, and the closer a city is to large universities, the more secular the city is likely to be. Mm-hmm. And I'm in an area that I wasn't like being raised in the religious South. It was very easy to grow up and not even give Christianity a second thought here.
So had you even ever heard the gospel before then?
No. As a matter of fact, as I was, had I ever heard someone, I'm sure I had heard people preach pieces of the gospel, but I wasn't going to sit long enough to hear the whole thing. And right. Again, remember, for a lot of us, whatever is being said just kind of bounces off because it makes no sense to us, right? So what I remember, though, investigating the claims of the gospel writers and determining that I felt that those claims were reliable historically, but still not understanding why Jesus would have to die on a cross. In other words, you could come to the conclusion that the Gospels are true, yet still not understand the gospel.
Yeah. That's a big point that Dr. James White makes, is that without understanding that the Bible is God's word breathed, yes, Christ rose from the dead, but in like an evolutionary standpoint, that's entirely possible. You need a revelatory piece of the puzzle to make sense of what that means and give it meaning.
That's right. The problem I have, though, is that you, and I'm an evidentialist. I am deeply committed to an evidential approach to my faith for a reason, because you could never have reached me and said, hey, we just need to understand that we presuppose that this Bible is the word of God. I understand the value it has in revealing truth. But remember, my family was divided between atheists and Mormons. And the Mormons in my family believed the Book of Mormon was, by its very nature, they presupposed it to be telling us the truth. And they said anywhere that it disagreed with the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, that is part of the great apostasy, the falling away of the Christian church that was corrected and restored by Joseph. So you presuppose this, and you only can learn what's true about God by presupposing this, and you judge everything else against this. I just knew that was not the way you're going to reach me. I would not trust what the New Testament said about Jim Wallace until I first learned or investigated it to determine that I trusted what it said about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, once I found it to be reliable, now I could listen to what it had to say about me.
Mm-hmm.
I simply could not. I was not interested in what your holy book says about me, because your holy book says something about me. The Baha'is have a holy book that says something about me. The Muslims have a holy book that says something about me. Why would your holy book be telling me something true about me? Well, first I determined it was telling me something true about Jesus of Nazareth. And I was like, okay, well, now I'm paying attention. And I was willing to read what it said about me.
So what do you think was the most important thing that you learned about Jesus of Nazareth that grasped, that got your attention, that made you say, okay, this is what's going on here?
Well, I think there's one central claim, right, of all of Christianity that matters more than any other claim. It's the claim of the resurrection. Because Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 15. If this isn't true, well, then there's no authority in the voice of, first of all, it's all a lie, because every claim related to Jesus centers on his deity as demonstrated by the resurrection. Look at the preaching of every apostle in the book of Acts. It's all going to come back to that foundational event, the resurrection, and that they were eyewitnesses of that resurrection, in which he did many, as Peter says in Pentecost, many signs, wonders were performed by Jesus, including the resurrection, which demonstrated that this is the man predicted by the Old Testament. So it all comes down to that. And so for me, it all came down to that. It's like we always say, Frank Turk and I say this a lot, that if you're somebody who rises from the dead, I have a tendency to pay attention. That is the truth of what separates Jesus from other historic wise teachers. And that's what, for me, it all came down to really working on this one issue. I would never have been open to the idea that anyone in history could ever rise from the grave.
Around what year did this kind of take place?
Well, I was 35, so it was 96-ish.
So did you draw upon scholars, or was this you sat down and only applied your method? Like, we now have just an overabundance. I mean, there's there's Lee Strobel that you mentioned, there's Frank Turk, there's just a whole slew of people that we can turn to. Like Gary Habermas has come and spoken to a group by our college, and I think we've come to understand more about the transmission of the gospel and just different argumentation that have gone out of vogue and then come back in, and new ones that have been made. Were there people that you relied upon on, or was this kind of you sat down and you just applied the method that you describe in stuff like cold case Christianity? Yeah,
so I can honestly say that back in 96, I know that Lee's book had just come out, maybe a couple of years earlier. I wasn't familiar with it. The Case for Christ. Yeah, I just didn't know about it. He was actually about a year later on our staff at Saddleback Church, at the church where I was attending. But I just didn't know much about his book in time to really. And I think really, if you look at that book, it kind of started an explosion of apologetics, because all of the people who he introduced in that book, I think, were largely unknown at the time, or were just starting to really become known in the popular imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And his interviewed people now, everyone knows who those folks are.
Yeah.
Maybe it was just me, being a non-Christian, that I just didn't know that there was a whole field of work out there. I didn't even know Josh McDowell, evidence that demands a verdict.
Yeah.
I just didn't have access to those resources. I knew, though, the template that I use to determine if an eyewitness is reliable. And so you'll see in my book, I think I might refer to some experts in the book, but really, the book doesn't do that. I'm also extremely, and I'll just tell you guys this, and I tell it to a lot of people. If you got a PhD behind your name, that doesn't have a lot of weight for me. Only because in my criminal trials, both sides will trot out somebody with letters behind their name, speaking about the exact same piece of evidence in front of the jury. And both people who have letters behind their name will say that the best inference is exactly the opposite from the first guy. So it turns out that if you just rely on experts, we ask the jurors to go back to what it is they are talking about. So for me, the most it would have been helpful, I think, is if I'd have known who these experts were, so I could be pointed back to what it is they were talking about. Because in the end, I asked jurors to go back to the evidence. Remember, this expert's just giving you his inference from the evidence, but you get to make your own inference from the evidence. You don't have to agree with that expert on either side. Now, it's good to have a broad spectrum of people who give you their opinion about what this best inference is. But if you go to my talks, for example, you will not hear me trot out the names of experts. So-and-so says this about the gun. I don't care what anybody says about it. Let me show you what the base evidence looks like, and you can make your own decision. That's what my talks are all about. I do not cite experts.
And so when you were doing your investigation, you looked at the primary source document, the scriptures, my guess is, to kind of make your own decision with regard to what it was saying, right? Is that what I hear you saying?
And I did this also with the Book of Mormon, because I did not have, my family, when they saw me becoming interested, my dad's not a believer, he's an atheist, but my dad's second wife is a Mormon. And I have 6 half brothers and sisters, all raised LDS. And one of them started to go, hey, here's a Book of Mormon. So I went out and bought the entire quad, which is the Old and New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, for a great price. And I read through all of it, applying the same methodology to the Book of Mormon that I was applying to the New Testament. I remember I read the Book of Mormon before I read the Old Testament. So I had to really kind of sift. I wasn't sure what if either of these made any sense. And, I really wasn't out to prove the Book of Mormon wrong, because I think I would have been very comfortable within the context of my religious family, who were not religious, but my immediate family, there's no believers anywhere, but my dad's second family does have Mormon believers. I would have been more than happy to join them. Not true. So I couldn't jump in. But
would you ever consider writing a book on what you did with the Book of Mormon too?
I've written a chapter on a book by Eric Johnson on how to witness to Mormons, in which I kind of walk through. And I've got a blog article on my website at coldcasechristianity.com that's very extensive, that just talks about the system as it's applied to the Book of Mormon. And so you can get a chance to see why you would, I don't know why anybody. But again, when you ask most Christians why they are a Christian, they don't tell you they went through this process to become a Christian. I bet you probably less than 1% of Christians went through any kind of evidential process to determine Christianity was true. Yeah. The vast majority will tell you they became Christians because they were raised that way, or they had an experience that demonstrated for them that Christianity was true. Right. Which is the exact same 2 things that my Mormon family tells me why they're
the same thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So with regard to the system, briefly, can you briefly explain what the system is and how it works?
Well, we have jury instructions in California that help jurors determine if a witness is telling the truth and could be considered reliable. And it's like 13 questions that we allow jurors to think about as they're listening to witnesses. They just break down into 4 categories, and here they are. Number 1, was the witness really there? Can you demonstrate that he was there? Sometimes people will say they saw something, but actually we determine they weren't even in the state. So it's all a lie. 2, have they been consistent? Or can they be corroborated in some way? Is there something? Now remember, corroboration and verification is always touch point. So if you have a witness, if you have a video of the event, well, the video acts like the witness. So that's not going to that's actually a witness. But if you're going to corroborate a living eyewitness in some way, it's only going to be a fraction of his or her statement. Because if you told me you jumped over the counter, and this guy jumped over the counter and screamed at the teller and pointed a gun at her and demanded money, well, I might be able to find a palm print to corroborate the witness's statement on the counter. But the palm print will not tell me what he was wearing or any of the other aspects of the witness's statement. What did he say? Was he carrying a gun? That palm print's not going to tell me any of that. So remember, I'm looking for corroborative evidence, but I expect it to be only a fraction of the overall statement. 3, did they change their story over time, or have they been honest and accurate consistently? And 4, do they possess a bias that would cause them to want to lie to me? So these are the things that I'm looking at in eyewitnesses. And I decided, well, could I apply that strategy to the gospel authors? So my strategy and my approach is different than, say, for example, years later, I was reading, Sean McDowell became a friend of mine. We were taking students on mission trips. And I finally got a copy of the second edition of his dad's book back in those days. Not the one that's out right now, but there was a second edition in the middle.
There was more evidence, I think.
Yeah, whatever it was called.
Yeah.
I got that. And I saw, and I worked with Josh and Sean, and I've seen the approach they take. They'll talk about, well, how many pieces of how many manuscripts do we have? What is the distance between the event and the first man? None of that stuff matters to me. Eyewitnesses come down to those 4 things. And if the gospel authors pass the test in those 4 areas, why would we not consider them reliable? Well, it comes down to they pass the test in those 4 areas, but we have hesitancy about their reliability because they include miracles. Look, if I always said this, if the gospels did not include miracles, how many people would find that the story is preposterous and discard Jesus of Nazareth as a historical character? Nobody would. Also, I see a lot right now is that there's a lot of scholarship and torment right now occurring related to contradictions that are seen between the Gospels. And I see people who are now, at least I see a lot in the last 5 years, that people will say, well, the genre of eyewitness accounts in the first century allowed for such a thing. I'm going to tell you right now, there is no reason to jump to some literary theory related to genre, because current eyewitnesses on an event that happens today, if there are 5 eyewitnesses, they will end up having the exact same amount of variation in their accounts. I know this only because I do it, okay? So I don't jump to, maybe the genre of eyewitness statements time included this. No, this is just what, now, can we determine what really happened? And by the way, defense attorneys love this, because they know there will be differences. In every case I've ever had, the defense attorney tries to play on those differences to convince a jury that no one should be trusted. Mm-hmm. And I've never lost a case because people understand. We even have a jury instruction that tells the jury that just because there are differences in their story, they are not to be discredited, because people see things differently and they remember different details and they put things in different orders and doesn't make a point. And I'll tell you that if you were to go back to the first century and you were the first or second reader of these documents, there were still people there that could explain why they sound and look differently. But the problem is as you get 30 years down the road, now all my witnesses are dead on a cold case. I don't have anyone to explain why you gave the statement in that order, or why you omitted this part, or why you said this thing doesn't make any sense. And I'm 30 years down the road. I can't go back to the scene and go, oh, yeah, that's why it happened. So I just don't see any reason to jump to genre or to jump to a literary theory to reconcile differences, because you will see some dramatic differences in eyewitness testimony. And by the way, our goal as detectives is to preserve those differences. So that's the first instruction we have. Dispatch calls me in the middle of the night to go to a homicide. I only have one instruction. Have the officers who are on the scene separate the eyewitnesses, because I want the differences to be maintained.
Interesting.
It'll help me to put the case to, I'm the puzzler. Don't you start puzzling me before I get it. So that's kind of my view of it, was that the differences actually in the accounts when I first read them were the thing that triggered for me, I should apply this template. Because this looks and feels texturally like eyewitness accounts. The level of variation is exactly what I would expect. So I just upset about
the kind of the theory that this is people writing at a later time to kind of have a put Mark in a priestly position and kind of have this tie everything back to Levitical priest and tie everything to Jesus. You see that theory as being less likely because you have these variations where you have people who emphasize different details, like for example in John 2, where he talks about leaving Capernaum, like that was John's hometown, and so he just makes this offhanded remark as if we would, if Tony and I were to say, oh, and we passed through Kalamazoo, and no one would know where Kalamazoo is at, but we would, because hey, that's our hometown.
Right. Well, there's some places in the Gospel of John, a pool, for example, that was destroyed in 70 AD, but he writes about it as though everyone knows where that is, because it probably is pre-70 AD. There's lots of ways to kind of dig out details about dating and all kinds of things from the Gospels. That's all well and good. I am just less inclined when I know that the tail that's wagging the dog on a literary theory is an effort to reconcile differences between the accounts. That's when I say, hold on. You don't need to develop a theory to reconcile differences any more than you would need to develop a theory today. Because I guarantee you, if I have a homicide tonight and I get called out, there will be differences that I just know. Now, what the great thing about it in live, I work cold cases. I can't always go back and talk to the witness, but on a fresh case, if I'm talking to witnesses and I see there's a problem, I can go back and ask the first witness. And I won't tell them what the second witness said. I'll just say, tell me again about this, trying to see if he'll add that detail that he admitted the first time to reconcile it. Unfortunately, we don't have that ability with the Gospels. We can't go back and re-interview the sources and ask kind of to mine out why there might be some variations between the accounts. Now, the problem I think it comes up, though, is that for Christians, we're like, hey, well, this is the inerrant word. How do we reconcile inerrancy? Would God allow the eyewitnesses to have the level of variation we would expect to have between eyewitnesses? I think he would, if he wanted us to be able to test them later. So I always look at it and say, if God was determined to present us with 4 accounts that have all the earmarks of reliable eyewitness testimony, he achieved it. Because we have 4 accounts that, it's my experience talking to eyewitnesses, are as varied and different as eyewitness accounts are in real cases in real time. So I had great confidence that that's the goal God has in his inerrant word. He has achieved it. Yeah. So you have to define what we mean by inerrancy, I think, to begin with.
Always defining in terms is important. And I think too, it's one of those things where atheists kind of, or at least critics who are being uncharitable or who are kind of parroting what they've heard. Even Bart Ehrman comes about with this theory of like, I need 3 signatured copies of the Gospel of Mark, and then I would take it as confidence that Mark wrote it. But at the same time, if let's say that all 4 gospel writers wrote exactly the same thing, well, you would just make that decision that, well, whoever the author was just wrote his name different 4 different times. And so what they're suggesting is, everything has to be said exactly the same. But you would say, well, there's collusion here, there's a conspiracy, or there's just a single author who just wrote different names on a sheet of paper.
Yeah, I actually think that regardless of how this would have turned out, and I know this is the case, right? I mean, we do cases, and regardless of how we put them together, there'll be a defense attorney who will develop a theory about how to defeat our case. This is just what happens. And you don't get to a case and you now I've got this one. I've learned from my other cases better. So now I know when I go to trial, that defense attorney is just going to say, hey, you know what? We have nothing to say. No, the defense attorney is going to spend months developing a robust theory to defeat ours. That's what defense attorneys do. God bless them. And I think there's a need to be properly. I'm not an anti-defense attorney guy. I talk about this in the book. There are 3 different kinds of defense attorneys: people who truly believe their client is innocent, people who truly believe that even if their client isn't innocent, that the system works best and requires all of us to do our best in defending people. That's probably the lion's share, by the way, of defense attorneys. And then the third is people who just love money, and they'll take any client and do anything if the money is big enough. That's a very small percentage in my view. The biggest percentage of people who think that even though my client is guilty, I have a robust duty to defend him to the best of my ability. And so that means that when I walk in, I don't care how strong my case is on the prosecution side, there will be if you've got the right attorney who's got a skill set. And by the way, if my case was slightly different, he would adjust. If my case was entirely different, he would adjust to that. And so I think that this is true also of any kind of skeptic who is pushing back against a theory, a claim, that regardless of what our claims would have been, regardless of whatever you imagine, if I had documents that were like X, there'd be no complaining. Oh, no, there would be. There would be a robust defense offered against that version of the Gospels. So I'm kind of like, okay, well, that's just the way this works. I think in the end, that there is a robust laboratory of epistemology. How do you know what we know? How do you defend what we know? How do you communicate what is true? That occurs every day in courtrooms across America. And this doesn't happen. I mean, you might write a paper and have your other equals, literary critics, maybe peer review the paper. But what happens in criminal trials is you have a theory about a claim and you present the theory about the claim and you get to test, number one, how do I know a theory is true? How do I know the claim is true? Two, how do I even communicate it well to a jury? What works, what doesn't work in communicating the claim? This is a laboratory for discovering truth and communicating truth to others that very few other disciplines get to experience repeatedly. That's why I've always felt like, this is why so many books about Christianity, defending the Christian worldview, have been written with titles like that involve some form of evidence, courtroom, or trial, right? Yet they're not written by anybody who spent any time in a criminal trial. So it turns out they're right, that this is the best analogy. This is the best place, I think, to learn how to discover truth and communicate it to others. But unless you've been doing that for your career, you're kind of on the outside wondering what it looks like inside that room. Yeah. So all I wanted to do in Cold Case was to show you what it looks like inside the room.